Hello Internet and welcome to Tech-Xample. Today we're looking at a very angry, very little flagship from AMD's past, the R9 Fury Nano. The Fury Nano was actually my second ever graphics card, following up the legendary GTX 750 Ti. Yes, a video is eventually coming talking about the 750 Ti, but probably not for a while though. Coming off an entry-level GPU all the way up to a monstrous flagship felt like seeing life in a new light. As part of the rather infamous Fiji flagship trio, the Nano dug a tiny, pun intended, but interesting niche for itself as a flagship small enough to fit into cases without a shipping dock amount of space. This came with some compromises, however, and it's going to be interesting to see if the tweaking AMD had to pull off to make such a hungry chip stay cool and kinda quiet was worth it. Following up on GCN2, the Fury lineup of cards utilized GCN3, which added a few new instructions, removed some odd image formats I've never heard of, Snorm LZ anyone, added some better lossless color compression, added some swanky new HEVC decoding, with the decoding coming along with the Fiji lineup with UVD6, along with a new multimedia engine that allowed for high quality scaling, and the ability to play back 4K video at 10-bit color depth. A boon to Blu-ray systems at the time. In terms of gaming, most of these added very little. Did help, however, was the addition of Vulkan 1.4 and full DX12 support. The improvements to the instruction sets were nice, and the better tessellation that was implemented isn't nothing. The real gain here was the improvement to color compression, saving some VRAM, which was much needed on the Fury lineup with its paltry 4GB of VRAM, and mobile chips, which relied on system memory to function. The biggest improvements to be seen were from node strings, allowing for higher clocks, improvements in memory tech, HBM being the big one here, and the continued prayer that games will come along and be able to utilize the massive core setups of GCN. Coming in with the fully unlocked Fiji chip, as part of the third generation of GCN cards codenamed Pirate Islands, the Nano sails in with an impressive 4096 processing cores, clocked at a nice, even 1 GHz, 64 ROPS, and the same 4 GB of HBM at a very wide 4096-bit bus as the rest of the Fury lineup. This 4 GB of VRAM was certainly a major point of contention at the time, especially when compared to its contemporaries, the GTX 980 Ti, which launched a few months earlier at the same price, and came with 6 GB of VRAM. Obviously, the big party trick of the Fury lineup was the high bandwidth part of high bandwidth memory, which ran nearly 52% faster than the pedestrian GDDR5 present on the Nvidia card, which AMD and their fans argued would allow the card to age significantly better than others said. While that might have been true at the time, in some cases, I'd argue that in the modern DX12 age, the 4GB capacity holds the rest of the card back. But all of this is true of the rest of the Fury lineup so far. An issue this card and all the Fury cards share is how useful that memory speed actually is. It seems the bigger issue with Fiji and GCN3 cards is how the memory bandwidth actually gets used by the chips themselves, with synthetic testing shows that after around the 360GB a second mark, the card kinda can't use the rest of the bandwidth. It can, obviously, but it's much less impactful than it could be, and it seems it's down to how GCN3 handles memory tasks, and the actual interface on the GPU itself that handles memory transfers not being entirely up to snuff. This means even if you could crank up memory space on the Fury, which is incredibly convoluted in today's times thanks to driver lockdowns from AMD, you wouldn't see a ton of improvements in anything other than crypto mining. What seems more impactful for Fiji, GCN3, and the Fury lineup is reducing latency on HBM, which is something I plan on looking at in a future video on the Unleashing series. The main differences between this card and the rest of the Fury family lies in clock speeds and voltages. While the Fury X has the same core and the same memory, it clocks a massive 50 MHz faster, or a rather sad 5%. If that's all that changed, it should be basically identical to the Fury X, but without the cold water cooling and that huge power draw, right? Well, no. Or, you see, there's something else at play here. In order to get the flagship Fiji GPU to fit in such a tiny card, the chip had to be power restrained to high heaven. To rather Sylvite, or flagship, 175 watts, meaning that unlike the Fury X, which chases maximum clocks all the time till it runs out of juice, the Nano instead is basically powered throttled from the get-go, meaning it's not hitting its higher clocks to nearly the same degree. Also, something to mention, the HDMI port on this card is limited to 1.4A, meaning it's not hitting the full 240Hz at 1080p my monitor could handle. This might be something to sway you if you're considering one of these for whatever reason. Obviously, the reason the Nano is such an interesting bit of tech comes down to its namesake, the Nano bit. Standing proud at a perfectly average 6 inches, it's the perfect size to fit into tight squeezes and small cases. Once one compares the Nano to a sibling card, the normal non-X Fury, you get a sense of the kind of magic AMD pulled off here, shrinking the hulking oversized flagship that needed 2 hands to hold into something you could fit into one hand easily. AMD touted the power of HBM in making this happen, which is certainly true, but all the other sacrifices they made will certainly come back to bite once you started testing the thing, wouldn't they? All GPUs are stock in these respective videos, short of whatever OC the board vendor decides to put into it, so this should be indicative of what you could see from any card you purchased today. For a more in-depth look at squeezing every bit of performance out of these cards, stay tuned for the Unleashing series, where I take cards to the reasonable extreme to eke out as much life from these cards as possible. Starting with Past Mark, the 2D score on the Nano falls into a comfortable 1020 points, was getting in line with the Fury and the RTX 3060, or I'll just say, the card has absolutely no issue doing basic 2D tests in Windows. Taking a look at the 3D test results, the Nano scores a decent, if no longer impressive, 9,254, while its compute rolls in at a 4,174. This puts the Nano a hair behind the non-X Fury, which scored over 10,000 points, which is nearly 10% higher, even with its cut down core size. At least the Nano beats its hungry little bigger brother in compute, which only hit 4,000 points. The win's a win, right? Moving on to Fury Mark II, is more a test on each individual card's power handling and the clock behavior under an, admittedly, unrealistic load. The Fury Nano, unsurprisingly, did not score terribly high on this one. 1080p, the Nano only managed 4,672 points, placing it almost 1,000 behind the normal Fury card. Of course, this isn't to say Nano is that much slower than its stunted brother, but it does show how AMD has tuned this particular card to chase a much lower power curve to keep thermals in check. The card seems to hone in on running much closer to 800 to 850 MHz at stock, rather than trying to reach its maximum clocks. This behavior will continue to see pop up when testing the Nano. Something to note in that in all of these tests, this is something that does vary game to game and even card to card, is the horrendous amount of cold line this thing makes. This card screams like it's being sent into fire every time you ask it to do something even moderately challenging, whines and squeals like a pig on helium being taught how to sing Italian opera when you ask it to do its job of, being a graphics processor. It is something to mind, particularly those of you out there with a sensitivity to high-pitched noises or tinnitus. The fan on the card is Whisper Library Quiet at least, who's got that going for it. Anyways, in Firestar Extreme, the Nano stands at 7,257 points, only a negligible 3% behind its sibling, the regular Fury, which is a much nicer showing for the little card. Achieving this kind of result at nearly half the power usage is nothing to scoff at. In time spy, it's more the same, with the Nano slinking in at 4,173 points, well behind the plain Fury, which hit 4,600 points, nearly 11% faster. Bit of a letdown for a card that costs a whopping $100 more when it was new. Finishing off the benchmark suite, we have Unigen's Superposition in both 1080p Extreme and 4K optimized formats. It's worth noting that in the 1080p test, the Nano nearly runs out of VRAM, while it exceeds its frame buffer in the 4K test. Not looking great for that 4GB HBM aging. In the 1080p test, this Nano scores 2,900 points, putting it neck and neck with the GTX 980, or the more modern RX 580. In 4K, the Nano hits 3,891 points, putting it slightly behind the 980, and more in line with its own GCN brother, the R9 390X. Starting off with the custom Dolphin benchmark, wherein I test Mario Galaxy at 4K with 4x SSAA, Vulkan renderer, and hybrid Uber shaders to get a feel for how the card performs in emulation tasks. The Nano managed to score 28.5 frames on average, which isn't a terrible result at all. Turning down SSAA or turning it off completely would give a much smoother result, pointing to the amount of horsepower we do have on tap here. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, on the other hand, show the other side to this GPU story. Before even starting the game up, an error declared the driver out of date welcomed me to the horrors ahead. AMD put this card out the pasture drivers-wise years ago, and that means some games will have errors, crashes, or refuse to boot up entirely. Maybe custom drivers will help this little Halo card keep going. Wink wink nudge nudge, check the unleashing video. Continuing past that warning, at 1080p high, we're scraping 17.8 frames on average with 1% lows of 1. Even with FSR off, everything has blur and pop in like no tomorrow. Moving to 1440p is even worse, giving only 14 frames on average, with 4K completely unplayable at 6 frames a second. A beautiful slideshow if there ever was one. Looking at the monitoring graph gives a clue to what's going on beyond any possible issues with the driver no longer being updated to the game's liking. The poor HBM is being hammered, all 4GB being used, even at 1080p. The game needs more memory that the Nano simply does not have. This is a real issue that I expect to keep popping up as more games use bigger textures and newer DX features. Moving on to Slime Rancher 2, we see much nicer results. At 1080p high, we're looking at 52 frames on average, with 1% lows being a decent 34.5. This is a very playable result for the old flagship, which continues into 1440p, where it hits an average of 35.5 and lows of 27. Turning down a few settings such as MSAA or shadows could give just enough of a boost to lock it at a solid 30. 4K continues to be a weak spot of the Nano, with results dropping down to 15 frames per second and 1% lows settling at 12. Pattern seems to be emerging here, and I'm curious to see if it continues into the next game. Speaking of the next game, in Overwatch 2, 1080p Ultra, the Nano nearly reaches 100 frames per second on average, with lows going down to 71.6. 1440p sees frame rates halve, with the average hitting 56.7 and lows settling at 37.4. It's worth pointing out the 0.1% lows of 10 here, since it's out of line with the 1080p 0.1%. 4K is a bit of an oddball here, with the Nano still hitting 45.1 frames per second on average, but both the 1% and 0.1% lows sync to 0.9 FPS. It looks like the poor Nano runs out of VRAM here, which causes this momentary stuttering every few seconds. I definitely do not recommend that. Stay away from 4K. If there's any point to be made here. Looking at all the data for the Nano might want to leave one thinking it's a tad underwhelming for such a vaunted and expensive card. But the data lives out something truly important about the Nano. It really was in a league of its own when considering its size. Nothing else from AMD or even Nvidia at the time came close to this amount of performance in this form factor. Even today, when flagship cars need many hundreds of watts, 4-slot coolers, and special power cables that tend to melt, the Nano sits small and mighty. It feels like a look into a parallel dimension, where we prioritize size and power efficiency over raw brute strength. I'm rather sad we don't see this concept being used much anymore. Not even the Vega Nano, which was supposed to be this card's direct successor, made its way out of its labs, leaving this little guy a truly unique, one-of-a-kind product. It does feel rather obvious to see why this concept didn't make it too far. I've narrowed it down to 3 reasons. The most obvious is that its niche is too small. Most people getting an enthusiast GPU are more than capable of powering a monster-sized card, and they don't need the card to be so itty-bitty, so why sacrifice performance on their top-of-the-line gaming card? A very obvious second issue comes round to is price. The Nano had full-fat prices, but almost a tier below type performance. That size came at a hefty premium, with the Nano launching at an eye-watering $649, matching the Fury X, a card that thoroughly outclassed the Nano in performance, and the GTX 980 Ti, a card that basically wiped the floor with the tiny Fury. Which leads me to the last point that makes the tiny flagship concept a bygone idea, which is the memory on the card itself. Most GPUs come with GDDR type memory, and for good reason. It's cheap, easy to design around, and can be binned and clocked however needed, within reason of course. The main downside in this particular case with GDDR, space requirements, and that's why AMD used HBM instead. This came at a cost, however, in a literal sense. While AMD themselves have been very hush-hush about the cost HBM adds to the board, rumors point to the Vega cards, which use HBM2, costing about $80 per memory stack on the card. I can't imagine the original HBM was much cheaper, especially considering it was brand new tech at the time. All this meant money not going into AMD or their board partners' pockets, while partners got to work with Nvidia and make oodles more cash while they used GDDR. Now, does this mean that the card was a waste of silicon? No, certainly not. AMD's big slogan with this card was "in a class of its own," and I really think they nailed it for once. While its niche was indeed small, it was a very real niche and one very few cards could fill, even in following generations. As such, the card gained a cult following online, prompting the online marketplaces to place these cards at a premium, still costing well over $100, sometimes much more than that. Here in 2026, does it make sense to buy one of these? When I would say no, as much as it pains my heart. While I definitely have some rose-tinted nostalgia for this card, and I'm surprised by how well it still stands up in modern titles, it can't be ignored how the tech world has done what it's always done: moved on. With no new drivers in years, a lockdown and tiny frame buffer, and rather silly asking prices online, your money is much better spent on more modern entry-level cards from any of the three GPU parties, which will crush this tiny Fury into the dust. But as a piece of history, the Fury Nano is a fascinating look into a future that never happened, and that's something to be furious about.